In the mid-1960s, behind the massive, sturdy walls of the USSR Ministry of Defense in Moscow, among the ceilings blackened by stormtroopers, generals and military strategists gathered, all hung with medals, to study intelligence reports brought by the distant tropical war from under a thick haze of electric light. It was about Vietnam. On the gray old films, covered with ripples, they saw something strange, the clumsy, insect-like flying machines of the Americans' Bell UH-1 helicopters, nicknamed Huey. These machines darted along the edges of the jungle like dragonflies, jumping out of the green into the flames of the hot landing pads. They threw soldiers into the buzzing air of war and carried the wounded away to the safety of the rear. For senior officers, whose military thought was burned by the sweat of Stalingrad and tempered by the fire of the Kursk Bulge, such flyers were nothing more than air trucks, clumsy, noisy, defenseless. Thin armor plates, booming engines, it seemed that only a salvo from a heavy machine gun could tear them down like a ripe pear. The gray-haired marshal of the armored forces, whose chest was buried in glittering medals, trophies from Berlin and Kursk, looked contemptuously at the films. His grin echoed in the minds of the members of the general staff. The American craving for these flimsy devices was seen as absurd, an unnecessary waste of forces, a distraction from the true ruler of modern combat, the king of the field, the main battle tank. Soviet power was measured not in the sky, but in metal, encased in tens of thousands of T-55s, T-62s, and menacingly brand new T-64s, which stood guard on the other side of the war, in the GDR. Their path was straight and brutal. If the flames of war invade Europe, this steel river will pour through the Fulda corridor, sweeping away everything in its path like an avalanche, and in a matter of days it will reach the banks of the Rhine. In the logic of the Soviet command, this flow was unstoppable. The helicopter is just an auxiliary mechanism, short-lived, a toy, not a tank killer. This confidence concealed one of the deepest and most dangerous mistakes of the Cold War. They laughed at the threat. This laugh, dry and confident, froze in the throats, turning into silent amazement when reality unfolded differently. Do you like the hidden pages of the Cold War and the battle of technology? Subscribe to Cold War Impact to learn more. After all, the basis of Soviet military power was based on one terrible principle: the multiple superiority of the masses. For many years, Western strategists threw knuckles at Abacus all night long, but the score always came out the same. The Warsaw Pact had a clear advantage on the usual European front. At their best, the USSR and its allies could have deployed more than 50,000 battle tanks against the grim 20,000th NATO army. The ratio is almost 3-to-1. In the decisive sections of the front, this difference reached 5-against-1. But these figures had not just technology, but the whole art of war, honed to the absolute, the Soviet doctrine of deep operations. Originating back in the 30s on the waves of pre-war enthusiasm and perfecting itself on the battlefields with Germany, it demanded to assemble continuous tank hordes into a single fist in order to break through the defenses in one place and pour a barrage to where the enemy was not particularly expected. By allowing armored trains to advance, more and more waves of armored armies had to rush through the whole, not pausing for a moment, not finishing off small pockets of defense, but plunging into the rearguards, seizing headquarters, cutting supply roads, breaking the enemy until the reserve bone was gathered into a fist. It was a plan of impetuosity, lightning strike and endless movement. The fate of each unit, the shackled order of the whole army, was subordinated only to this idea. The tanks were designed for a single purpose: to be cheap to produce, easy to maintain, and sharpened for Hydra attacks due to their low silhouette and powerful guns. Artillery, famous for its devastating hail, turned enemy defenses into ruins long before the first tanks appeared. The infantrymen, recruited during 2 months of military service, were sharpened for the sake of one thing: a frenzied breakthrough at speed. And the entire map of Europe, devoid of high mountains, and especially the powerful passage near the Fulda lowlands, is a highway for the Red Armor legions, their artery. In the face of such an onslaught, NATO had only the harsh truth: to catch up and overtake the USSR in the race of machines, economically, technically and politically, was an impossible task. The only way to resist, albeit a desperate one, was with nuclear weapons: hold the front as long as possible and, when the steel streams of the Soviet armies poured into the breakthrough, close them with nuclear fire, turning the field of Europe into ruins, already liberally watered with the blood of 2 world wars. This plan, terrible and suicidal, was the trigger for Armageddon. And both sides understood this. Americans, looking into such an abyss, feverishly searched for an alternative. They needed a force capable of turning the tide of battle, technology, or tactics that allowed a few to do the impossible, to crush the enemy's mechanized hordes, inside out, taking the initiative not by quantity, but by novelty. And so, looking at their M48 and M60 tanks, they saw good quality, but too expensive and too rare cars. Infantry anti-tank weapons improved, but forced the soldiers to come close to where the muzzle of the tank and death merge into one. The answer lay not in the iron of the earth, but in the sky. This thought was not born immediately, but appeared through the swampy slush of the Vietnam War. In the 60s, the U.S. Army massively introduced the UH-1 Huey into battle. Their main task is the landing. For the first time, a company could be transported through the jungle, inaccessible to both a tank and a jeep, to find itself right in the meat grinder itself. This tactical revolution, called air mobility, opened the Achilles heel. At the moment of approach to the landing site, helicopters were vulnerable, slow, and the noise of their blades warned the enemy in advance. Protection was needed. The decision was born in the throes of improvisation. Technicians and gunsmiths fitted machine guns and unguided rocket launchers to the sides of conventional Huey transport vehicles right on the battlefield. This is how the first gunships appeared, flying nearby and covering the landing zone with a hurricane of fire, preventing the enemy from raising their heads. A banal flying bodyguard, but that's exactly how the principle was implemented. A helicopter can be a platform for an attack. The success of the side gunners was obvious. The new combat vehicles gave the infantry a unique form of instant, on-call, air support, faster and more targeted than slow and bulky aircraft. The Army quickly consolidated its experience, and soon helicopters appeared in the sky, designed from birth for combat, not for transportation. But the real rift, and the source of the Soviet generals' future fear, brought another breakthrough, a new death. The guided anti-tank missile, ATGM, entered the scene. By combining the maneuverability of rotorcraft and the deadly precision of new weapons, engineers gave birth to an attack helicopter. A car whose sole purpose was to hunt tanks, away from their anti-aircraft fire, from the flanks, from a height. This new predator was a direct challenge to the armor of the Red Army, the very force that had been considered impenetrable for years. Now he had to be thrown into battle. The Soviet marshals, busy with their Steel Panthers, did not yet know that the rules of land warfare had changed forever. October 6, 1973. Sinai Peninsula, among the scorching myriads of the sun and swirls of sand, soldiers of the 3rd Egyptian Army. It was a moment of supreme triumph. They had crossed the Suez Canal, smashed through the supposedly impregnable Barv line, and were now pouring into the desert. Their tanks, Soviet-made T-55 seconds and T-62 seconds, advanced in classic formation. A wave of steel under the hot desert. Sunday. Their confidence was absolute. They were executing Soviet deep battle doctrine perfectly against an enemy caught completely by surprise. For the first few days, it was a stunning success. Then the battlefield changed. An Egyptian tank commander peering through the narrow vision slit of his T-62 would have seen it first as a speck on the horizon. It wasn't a jet moving too fast to track. This was slower, more menacing. It was an Israeli AH-1 Cobra, a machine the Americans had refined in Vietnam and supplied to their ally. 2. The Egyptian crew, it looked frail like the transport helicopters they had seen before. They trained their coaxial machine gun on it, waiting for it to come into range, but it didn't. The Cobra held its position, hovering just outside the effective range of the tank's weapons. There was no warning, no sound of an incoming shell, just a sudden catastrophic explosion that ripped the tank next to him apart. The turret, weighing several tons, was thrown a dozen meters into the air, spinning like a top before crashing into the sand. Before the commander could even process what had happened, another tank in his platoon erupted in a ball of fire, and then another. The source of this destruction was a tiny white dot streaking across the desert sky. The BGM-71 TOEO missile fired from the Cobra. The missile unspooled a pair of thin wires, trailing them all the way to the target. The gunner in the helicopter simply had to keep his crosshairs on the tank, and the missile would guide itself to the point of impact. For the tank crews on the ground, it was terrifyingly impersonal. They were being hunted. They were being destroyed by an enemy they couldn't see and couldn't fight. Panic began to ripple through the tank formations. Their greatest strength, their concentrated armored mass, was being rendered useless. They were being picked apart one by one with surgical precision. The reports that flowed back to the Soviet military advisors embedded with the Egyptian and Syrian armies were frantic and filled with disbelief. In Moscow, analysts at the main intelligence directorate, the GRU, pieced together the data, and the picture that emerged was horrifying. During the intense tank battles of the Yom Kippur War, Egypt and Syria lost over 2,500 tanks in just 18 days, while Israeli tankers and their Centurions and Patton accounted for the majority of the kills. The impact of the attack helicopter was undeniable and disproportionate to its numbers. A single Cobra helicopter costing a fraction of a main battle tank could destroy multiple tanks in a single sortie, without ever entering the effective range of their guns. The kill ratios were astonishing. In some engagements, Israeli helicopter teams were claiming 10, even 15 tank kills for every helicopter lost. This was the data point that sent a chill through the Soviet General Staff. Their entire European war plan was predicated on a massive rapid tank offensive. The Fulda Gap strategy relied on unstoppable momentum. But the lessons from the Sinai Desert painted a grim new picture. What if NATO deployed not a handful of these tank-killing helicopters, but hundreds of them? What would happen to their steel avalanche if it was met by swarms of these nimble predators firing guided missiles from the cover of hills and forests? The tank columns would be bled white long before they ever reached the Rhine. Their momentum would be broken, their formations shattered. The core of their military doctrine was suddenly, shockingly vulnerable. The shock in Moscow was matched by a surge of vindication in Washington. The performance of the Cobra in the hands of the Israelis was the definitive proof of concept the U.S. Army had been waiting for. The ad hoc gunships of Vietnam had evolved into a proven dedicated tank killer. The data from the 1973 war was irrefutable. It immediately silenced skeptics within the Pentagon and Congress who had questioned the cost and viability of the attack helicopter concept. The result was an immediate and massive acceleration of the Army's advanced attack helicopter program. This wasn't going to be another modified transport helicopter. This was to be a machine designed from the ground up for one mission and one mission only: to survive and kill tanks on a high-intensity European battlefield. It needed to be fast, heavily armored, capable of fighting at night and in bad weather, and armed with a new generation of even deadlier fire and forget missiles. The collision in the Sinai had proven the theory. Now, the Americans were beginning the process of turning that theory into an industrial-scale system, purpose-built to dismantle the Soviet war machine. The isolated encounters in the desert were about to escalate into a full-blown technological arms race, and the Soviets were already dangerously behind. The lessons of the Sinai were not just studied in Moscow and Washington. They were weaponized. The attack helicopter was no longer a curious battlefield support asset. For NATO, it became the central pillar of a new defensive doctrine designed specifically to break the back of a Warsaw Pact invasion. The strategy was called active defense, and it was a direct answer to the Soviet concept of deep battle. NATO planners knew they could not create a static fortified line across the entire length of the Iron Curtain. It was too long and they had too few troops. Instead, active defense envisioned a flexible, mobile defense in depth. Lightly armed units would identify and delay the main thrust of a Soviet tank attack, channeling the armored columns into pre-selected kill zones and waiting to spring the trap in. These zones would be the helicopters. Throughout the late 1970s and into the 1980s, this doctrine was drilled into every NATO soldier. In West Germany, new air cavalry and attack helicopter regiments were established. Their pilots spent thousands of hours training in the very hills and forests where a real war would be fought. They perfected nap of the earth flying, using terrain to mask their approach. They mastered pop-up attacks where a helicopter would hide behind a ridge, rise just long enough for its gunner to acquire and fire at a target, and then immediately drop back into cover before the enemy could react. It was a deadly game of hide and seek, and the helicopters held all the advantages. Soviet intelligence watched this evolution with growing alarm. GRU agents and satellite imagery painted a clear picture. The annual Reforger exercises, NATO's massive dress rehearsal for World War II, became showcases for this new way of war. Soviet observers would see mock tank battles where entire battalions of American M1 Abrams tanks were declared destroyed in minutes by helicopter squadrons. The coordination was what was most unnerving. The helicopters didn't just fly around looking for targets. They were integrated into a sophisticated command and control network. They received real-time targeting data from ground observers, from star surveillance aircraft, and from scout helicopters. This wasn't just a collection of gunships. It was a systematic worked killing machine. The Soviet plan relied on speed and mass, but NATO was building A system designed to dismember that mass piece by piece with precision. And from a safe distance. The pressure intensified dramatically in 1986. That was the year the U.S. Army began deploying its new advanced attack helicopter in Europe. It was a machine that seemed to have been designed by Soviet tankers in their worst nightmares. Its name was the AH-64 Apache. The Apache was a generational leap beyond the Cobra. It was a heavily armored twin-engine beast built to survive on a battlefield saturated with anti-aircraft fire. But its true terror lay in its systems. Its target, acquisition and designation site or TDS, allowed its gunner to see and target enemy vehicles from miles away, day or night in any weather. Soviet doctrine, often called for moving tank formations, under the cover of darkness or bad weather to mask their advance. The Apache rendered that tactic obsolete. Its pilots and gunners owned the night. Most terrifying of all was its primary armament, the AGM-114 Hellfire missile. Unlike the wire-guided TOW, the Hellfire was a semi-active laser-guided missile. A gunner in the Apache or even a scout on the ground could paint a target with an invisible laser beam. The missile, once launched, would fly on its own towards this laser spot. This meant an Apache could pop up, fire a missile, and immediately dive back into cover. While the missile guided itself to the target, it could even fire multiple missiles at multiple targets in rapid succession. For a Soviet tank commander, the first sign of an attack would be the catastrophic, fiery death of the tank. Next to him, the Apache quickly became more than just a weapon. It was a symbol. Its menacing insectoid frame became the physical embodiment of America's technological counter to Soviet brute force. For the hundreds of thousands of conscripts sitting in T-72 and T-80 tanks across Eastern Europe, the Apache was the monster hiding behind the next hill. It represented a specific high-technology threat that their training and equipment was simply not prepared to handle. The relentless pressure of this one system began to erode the very foundation of Soviet military confidence. The deployment of the AH-64 Apache to West Germany was not just another move on the Cold War chessboard. It was a checkmate against the Red Army's most powerful piece. Within the gray, imposing buildings of the Soviet General Staff, the mood had shifted from arrogant confidence to a grim, almost frantic urgency. Intelligence reports on the Apache's capabilities were analyzed and reanalyzed. The results of war games and simulations were consistently catastrophic. In every scenario, the initial Soviet armored thrust into Europe was blunted, then systematically annihilated by NATO's helicopter forces. The laughter of the 1960s was a distant memory. Now marshals and generals, men who had built their careers on the doctrine of the unstoppable armored offensive, were forced to confront a terrifying new reality. Their primary war plan was obsolete. Emergency meetings were convened. Research and development bureaus were issued top priority directives. The entire Soviet military-industrial complex was tasked with finding an answer to the American attack helicopter. They scrambled to develop countermeasures, but they were trying to solve a new problem with old thinking, and every attempt they made fell short. Their first and most obvious Response was to beef up their mobile air defenses. Every Soviet tank regiment was accompanied by a battery of Su-234 Shulka anti-aircraft vehicles. The Shulka, with its 4 radar-guided 23mm cannons, had been effective in the Middle East against Israeli jets, but it was fundamentally useless against the threat posed by the Apache. The Shulka's radar and guns required a direct line of sight to the target. It was designed to shoot down aircraft flying overhead. NATO's helicopter doctrine, however, was built on avoiding that very scenario. An Apache would never fly high and slow over a Soviet tank column. It would use hills and tree lines for cover, popping up for only a few seconds to fire a Hellfire missile from miles away. By the time the Shulker's crew even detected the brief appearance, the missile was already in flight, and the Apache was safely back behind cover. They were trying to fight a sniper with a shotgun. The next layer of defense was the proliferation of man-portable air defense systems, or manpads. Millions of shoulder-fired SA-7 Steyr and the more advanced SA-14 and SA-16 Igler missiles were distributed among frontline troops. The idea was to create a dense low-altitude umbrella of missile threats that would make it suicidal for a helicopter to operate. But again, American technology was a step ahead. The Apache and Cobra were equipped with sophisticated infrared countermeasures. The A divided by ALQ-144, an omnidirectional jammer nicknamed the Disco Ball, was designed to confuse the simple heat-seeking sensors of these missiles. Combined with flare dispensers, the helicopters could often decoy the incoming missile away. More importantly, the effective range of these early man-pads was significantly shorter than the range of the Hellfire missile. An Apache pilot could sit outside the man-pad's engagement envelope and destroy Soviet tanks with impunity. The foot soldier with his missile launcher would be killed by the very tank he was trying to protect, never even getting a chance to fire. Finally, the Soviets tried to fight fire with fire. They had their own formidable attack helicopter, the Mi-24, known to NATO by the reporting name Hind. Western observers called it the flying tank for its heavy armor and impressive array of rockets, guns, and missiles. But the Hind was a product of a different philosophy. It was designed as an aerial infantry fighting vehicle, a heavily armed transport meant to fight in the thick of the battle, suppressing enemy infantry and fortifications to support the advance of their own tanks. It was a brawler, not a hunter. It lacked the sophisticated long-range sensors, the night fighting capabilities, and the fire-and-forget missiles of the Apache. In a direct confrontation, the result was a foregone conclusion. The Apache would detect the Hind from miles away, fire a Hellfire, and destroy it before the Hind's crew ever knew they were a target. The Soviets had built a flying tank to fight in a knife fight, while the Americans had built a flying sniper to win from a mile away. This string of failed counter measures had a devastating effect on the morale of the men who would have to fight the war. A former Soviet T-80 company commander recalled the feeling of utter helplessness in his memoirs. "We were told our new tanks were the best in the world," he wrote. "But we knew from intelligence briefings and rumors about the American Apache. We knew it could see us in the dark when we couldn't see We knew it could kill us from a distance where we couldn't shoot back. We practiced firing our main guns into tree lines where we thought they might be hiding. It was a useless gesture. We all knew that if war came, we were just lambs, being led to a slaughter we would never see coming. The inability of the Soviet military to field an effective counter to the American attack helicopter was more than just a tactical or technological failure. It was a symptom of a much deeper systemic rot. The Apache was not simply a machine. It was the product of an entire ecosystem of innovation that the rigid centrally planned Soviet state could no longer compete with. It required advanced electronics, sophisticated software, cutting-edge materials, science, and a level of systems integration that was beyond the grasp of the sclerotic Soviet defense industry. While Soviet engineers could still build powerful, brutally effective tanks and artillery, they were falling critically behind in the new age of information warfare. This single weapon system placed immense pressure on the Soviet Union to even attempt to match the Apache and its associated technologies. They would have had to divert astronomical sums of money from an already crumbling civilian economy. It was one of many technological fronts, along with stealth aircraft, precision guided munitions, and strategic missile defense, where the Americans were pulling away, forcing the Kremlin into a ruinous spending race they could not win. The fear of the Apache in the Fulda Gap was a powerful accelerant for the economic and political collapse that was to come. The helicopter became a symbol of a technological gap that had widened into a chasm. The Cold War ended not with a bang, but with the fall of a wall and the dissolution of a state. The great apocalyptic tank battle in Europe never happened. For years, the question of what would have occurred remained a matter of simulation and speculation. Then in 1991, the world received a brutal televised answer. The place was not Germany, but Kuwait and Iraq. The enemy was not the Soviet army, but Saddam Hussein's Iraqi forces, an army trained, organized, and equipped almost entirely along Soviet lines. They fielded thousands of Soviet-made T-72 tanks, the same model that formed the backbone of the Warsaw Pact's armored divisions. They employed Soviet Doctrine. On the night of February 26, 1991, during Operation Desert Storm, a massive column of this Iraqi armor was retreating from Kuwait City along Highway 80. They were caught in the open, in a perfect kill zone. What followed was not a battle. It was a slaughter. A swarm of U.S. Army Apaches descended on the trapped columns. For the Iraqi tank crews, the experience was the realization of every Soviet soldier's worst fear. Through their night vision systems, the American gunners saw the desert lit up with the heat signatures of running engines. They were picking targets on a screen, utterly detached from the carnage they were unleashing. One after another, Hellfire missiles stray out of the darkness. T-72 seconds erupted in brilliant flashes of white hot flame, their turrets blown clean off, their ammunition cooking off in spectacular secondary explosions. The attack was relentless, precise, and completely one-sided. When the sun rose, Highway 80 was a smoldering, twisted scrapyard of hundreds of Iraqi tanks and vehicles. It became known as the Highway of Death. It was the ultimate, undeniable proof. The theory had become terrifyingly real. In the end, the American attack helicopter never had to destroy a single Soviet tank in combat. It didn't need to. Its true victory was psychological. It was a weapon system so effective, so perfectly tailored to exploit the core weakness of its adversary that it rendered the enemy's entire war strategy obsolete before the first shot was ever fired. It forced a generation of Soviet marshals to stare at their maps of Europe and realized that their unstoppable steel avalanche would never reach the Rhine. It would be broken and burned in the fields of Germany by an enemy it could not fight. The laughter in Moscow had long since died. In its place was the silent, grudging acceptance of defeat.